of Political Science at Texas Tech University, where she's director of the Climate Science Center, the CEO of ATMOS Research and Consulting, and chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. And also, and this is something I will be asking her about, she works with science mums and is very active on social media. So, Dr. Hayhoe, Katharine Hayhoe, very warm welcome to the Future Trends Forum here in Madrid. Thank you for joining us. And the screen, I should say, not the floor, is yours.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you here today, and I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person. So I am a climate scientist, and I do study what's happening to our planet, and that's where I wanted to begin, because when we look at the science, the question we have is, why are we not moving faster? So let me share my screen with you, just 1 minute. It is not an exaggeration to say that we're conducting an unprecedented experiment with the only planet that we have. We've known about this experiment that we've been conducting by digging up and burning massive amounts of fossil fuels for almost 200 years. These are the actual scientists who told us that digging up and burning coal back then and oil and gas today produce heat-trapping gases that build up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. Today, thanks to the work of the IPCC, we know that the warming that we are seeing is unprecedented in the history of humans on this planet. And that's why it matters, because it affects us. And we also know that one of the biggest ways that this is affecting us is not through global warming per se, but through what I call global weirding. In other words, our extreme events are becoming more dangerous. Our heat waves, our droughts, our wildfires, our cyclones, typhoons, and hurricanes, all of these are being supersized in a warmer world. And we see the evidence today in the headlines. We know that wherever we live, it's as if we have a pair of dice, and you always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally, a heat wave, a drought, a storm. But as the planet warms decade by decade, it's as if it's sneaking in and taking one of those numbers and turning it to another six, and taking another one and turning it into a six, and maybe turning another one into a seven. And that's when we look at the news and we say, how can we have another extreme heat wave already, and it's just June? How can places like Western North America have dangerous heat, extreme drought, and record-breaking flooding? How is it that we see records being broken all around the world? Almost every day, it seems like. And we scientists can even put numbers on it. We can put numbers on just how much climate change is weighting or loading the dice against us. We know that the deadly floods in Germany last summer were 9 times more likely in a warmer world. We know that the heat wave and wildfire across Canada and the United States last summer were 150 times more likely. We know that these are affecting us today, and it's not about saving the planet. This ball of rock will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It is quite literally about saving us humans, and all the other living things that share this planet with us. That is what is at stake. When we see the changes in our world today, why do we care about them? Because they affect the quality and the quantity of the water we drink, and we can't survive without water. Burning fossil fuels produces so much air pollution that it's responsible for 10 million premature deaths per year. That's double the number of annual COVID deaths from air pollution alone. We know that as carbon dioxide levels increase, plants grow more quickly and the nutritional quality of our food goes down. Since the 1980s, $5 billion worth of crops have been lost every year on average, much of that in low-income countries, due to climate-related changes. We know that it's affecting the nature that surrounds us and the biodiversity on which our own lives depend. And we also know that every aspect of our infrastructure, our buildings, our roads, our energy systems, our water systems, they were all built for a planet that no longer exists. We are the ones who are most at risk from this issue. And there's even a connection to geopolitical instability and war. Svetlana Kharkovska is a climate scientist like me. She's Ukrainian and she's an IPCC author. And as they were finalizing the IPCC Working Group 2 report in February, as she was on the Zoom call speaking to the other scientists, this is what she said. She said, human-induced climate change and the war in Ukraine have the same roots, our dependence on fossil fuels. But we will not surrender in Ukraine, and we hope the world will not surrender in building a climate-resilient future. Climate change is not its own standalone issue. It's not, I care about this and this and this and this, and I care about climate change. No, the reason we care about climate change is because of what we already care about. If all that were happening was the average temperature of the planet were increasing by 2 or 3 or even 4 degrees, but nothing else were happening, it would be a scientific curiosity. But what is actually happening is climate change is affecting what we care about. It affects our infrastructure, our economy, our energy. It is affecting our water, our natural resources, and our food. It's affecting our health, our biodiversity. It affects political conflict. And most of all, it affects those who have done the least to contribute to the problem. The 7% of our carbon emissions are produced by the 50% poorest people on the planet. Yet they are the ones bearing the brunt of the impacts. Since the 1960s, the gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world has increased already by as much as 25% thanks to climate change. There's a military term that they use to describe climate change, a threat multiplier. What that means is it takes all of the threats we already face today and it multiplies them. And to turn it around, if we don't fix climate change, we can't fix anything else. That's why this matters. So how do we engage the public on this? Well, what this means is you don't have to be a certain type of person to care about climate change. You don't have to be a green person. You don't have to be an environmental person. You don't have to be a sustainability person. Whoever you already are, you already have every reason you need to care. And what do we need to do? We need to help people connect the dots. What do they already care about as a person? What does that organization already care about? What is that company's goals? What does that city worry about? What does a better future look like for any of us? We all might have visions of that better future that look slightly different, but we know it includes a safe place to live, clean air to breathe, water to drink, food to eat. We know that we all want that better future, but we will not get there if we do not address the crises of climate, biodiversity, and pollution. So that begs the question that we're all wondering, why aren't we acting at speed to address this thing? If it's really that urgent, if it's really that all-encompassing, if it really affects every aspect of our life on the planet Earth, which it does, if our chance of a better future really hinges on addressing this issue, why aren't we moving faster? Well, often we think, if people just knew the facts, surely they'd move faster. But we scientists have been sharing the facts for decades. It's been 55 years since scientists warned a US president of the dangers of climate change. It's been 33 years since the first IPCC report came out. So then we think, okay, well, if it isn't that they don't have the facts, maybe it's just that they aren't worried. And we look around and we think, well, I'm worried. And a lot of the people I know are worried, but we're only a small group of people. Everybody else is just going about their business, not worried. So we need to make them worried, which means we need to dump more fear-based facts on them. More about glaciers melting and ice sheets retreating and sea level rising and polar bears heading towards extinction. But what happens is this, as climate changes, we get worried. And if we share more scary data with people who don't know what to do about it, people reject it even more. And inaction solidifies, because the way our brains are wired is that fear and anxiety causes us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. Tali Sherrod is a neuroscientist, and she's literally speaking about the way our brains work here. Isn't that what we see with climate change? People are withdrawing, they're freezing, they're giving up rather than taking action. And so climate just changes more. This is why all of the headlines that we see, the vast majority of the headlines we see are all about the negative impacts of climate change. And we need to understand the risk, but this is why they are not sufficient. This is why people are not engaged. Because although this is our image of what the world looks like, when we look at polling data, what we actually look like is this. Most people are worried. The vast majority are actually worried. There's a small group that aren't worried, and there's a small group that are activated. But most people are worried, but they don't know what to do. In fact, poll after poll and country after country shows that the majority of people are worried, but most of them feel hopeless and don't know where to start. And only a small percentage are activated. So this is a very different picture than if people don't have the facts or if people aren't worried, isn't it? So if they don't have the facts, you would give them the facts. If they aren't worried, you would want to make them worried. But if they're already worried, but they're paralyzed and they don't know what to do, the way we engage is very differently. And that is where we are today with the majority of people. Now you might say, well, don't you know, Katharine, don't you hear that there's all these people saying, oh, it doesn't matter, you know, like the banker who was saying, oh, those climate nut jobs. That's a defense mechanism against fear. Denial is a defense mechanism against that fear. They bury it deep and they say, oh, it can't be that serious, or it's not that bad, or it's not here yet, because they don't want to confront the fear. The vast majority of us are already afraid. And how could we not be? But we don't know what to do. And so because of that, we do nothing. So to put it a different way, we don't understand the risks of inaction, and we don't understand the rewards of action. And we need both of them in equal proportions. So far, we've fallen 99% on the risk side and only 1% on the solution side. And if you try to go to 2%, people say, oh, people will become too complacent if you talk about solutions too much. Well, they're not complacent now. And how is that going? It's not going fast enough because it's two sides of the coin. We have to understand there's a problem. Otherwise, why would we want to fix it? But we also have to understand that we need solutions, because otherwise, what do we know what to do? Why do we not understand the risk? It's because we as humans are prone to something called psychological distance. We invoke this all the time when we don't exercise as much as we should, or we don't eat the things that we're supposed to eat. We don't save as much money as we're supposed to or told to. But with climate change, we see every aspect of psychological distance coming into play. We're worried about it, but we still see it as a future issue. We still see it as an issue that is far away from us in space. We see it as abstract, global average temperature, rather than the heat wave right here that is costing me money. And we see it as irrelevant to our primary concerns. That's just what people care about if they're green or environmental or sustainable. It's not what I care about. So what do we need to do? We need to talk about the risks now, here, in ways that are concrete and relevant to people's lives. I talk about the risks to my child because I'm a mother. I talk about the risks to snow because I love skiing. I talk about the risks to gardening because I garden. I talk about the risks to the place where I live in Texas. I talk about risks to the country of Canada, where I'm from. I talk about the risks that matter to me, to other people who care about the same things as I do. That makes it concrete and relevant, as well as here and now. So we need to talk about how climate change affects us and what we can do to fix it. But when I was talking about this a few months ago to a group of people, they said, well, that's fine, but how do I make people care about the polar bears? How do I talk about polar bears where I live? And this group of people, they were not from Svalbard, they were not from the Arctic. There were no polar bears where they lived. And so I said, you don't. When I'm in Texas, where I live, I talk about cotton farming. If you are in Western North America or Greece or many other areas of the world like Australia, we can talk about wildfire. We can talk about floods. We can talk about drought. Because to care about climate change, you don't have to be a certain type of person. You just have to be a human being. You have to live somewhere on this earth. You have to care about something, someone, someplace. And no matter where you live, no matter what you care about, climate change is affecting it and affecting you. And that means that you already have every reason you need to care. You understand the risks and you have the motivation to act. But that's only half of the puzzle. The other half is what we can do to fix it. And this is so important because what we see in our polling data, where people feel hopeless and helpless and they don't know where to start, is a stunning lack of efficacy. Efficacy is the idea that if I do something, will it make a difference? And today, most people would say, no, I don't think it would make a difference. Everywhere I go, I hear people say, well, we're just a small country. We're just 1% of global emissions or 2% of global emissions. What difference does it make? It's the most common argument I hear in my home country of Canada. And then I go to Ireland and people say, well, I don't know if you've heard this before, but we're such a small country. What difference could we make? And then I'm speaking virtually to a group in Norway and they say, well, we're just a small country. What difference could we make? None of us think that we can make a difference. And because of that, we do nothing. People often argue, do we need individual change or system change? And my answer to that is yes. We need both, because what is a system made of other than people? How does a system change other than when people, individuals, call for that change, right? And so as individuals, we have to realize that we can make a difference. And that is what I believe hope is. Hope and efficacy are the two biggest things that we are missing as individuals and as organizations. But hope is not just assuming the future will be better or just hoping the future will be better. Real hope begins by saying it's bad and it's going to get worse, but there is a vision of a better future. And this is key, and this is directly tied to efficacy. There is a path to get there. Action and hope are tied together like this. And people who are acting recognize this. One person who's acting, of course, is Greta Thunberg. And she says the one thing we need more than hope is action, because once we start to act, hope is all around us. In more science terms, once we start to act, motivation and efficacy flourish. But if we wait to feel efficacy and motivation before we act, we'll never find them. So the action of acting affects our perspective. At this point, you might be saying, all right, so where do we start? How do we get this going? What's the first domino that we knock over in this chain? It turns out that there is something that we are not doing that we could be doing a lot more of. And when I found out what it was, I decided I would do a TED Talk on it. So I did a TED Talk 4 years ago now called "The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change is Talk About It." Why does that matter so much? Well, this is some data from the United States, but based on my experience, I see the same split in other countries. Most people think it's happening, but most people are not talking about it. We're worried, but we're not talking about it because we don't know what to do. We say, well, everybody I know is already worried, so why talk about it? Or they don't care about it like I do, so why talk about it? Or there's nothing we can do, so why talk about it? And so we self-silence. But as George Marshall, who's a British expert in climate communication, he founded the organization Climate Outreach. As George Marshall says, talk is the fertile field in which cultural change begins. In its absence, it's impossible for a group of people to solve a problem. The goal of the conversation is not to tell people about climate change. It's to expand the number of people in the conversation. By talking about what? By talking about why it matters and what we can do to fix it. That is literally what knocks over the first domino. Is talking sufficient? Of course not. We need action. But how do humans act together without talking? Talking is the first step. The first step to what? To showing people that, as the science says, and this is the science here, every action matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every year matters, and every choice matters. Doesn't that statement give you a sense of efficacy? Doesn't it make you feel like, oh, so this actually does matter? It does. Even what we're doing right here matters. So climate changes and we get worried. But here's where we break the vicious cycle. What do we talk about? How it affects our company, how it affects our organization, how it affects our city, how it affects our country, how it affects our personal lives, and what positive solutions look like. And when you combine the risk with the reward, people feel empowered because they know what to do, and action results. And this is the way our brains are wired. To go back to the neuroscience, the human brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not avoiding harm. So reframe your message so the information you provide induces hope, not dread. So what's the last piece? The last piece is we need to talk about what we can do to fix it. And there's so much to talk about there. And that is where the Nature Conservancy is, the organization I serve as chief scientist. And that is where so many other organizations are around the world. We can talk about climate solutions that stop carbon from going into the atmosphere, like efficiency and clean energy. We can talk about climate solutions that take carbon out of the atmosphere, not just tree planting or restoring ecosystems, but regenerative agriculture. We can talk about solutions that helps communities in need, like greening low-income neighborhoods to provide flood control and a tree canopy to cool them down during heat waves. We can talk about restoring coastal systems to protect from storm surge and filter water and provide a source of wood and provide habitat. We can talk about all of the different solutions that Project Drawdown lists. And if you haven't seen Project Drawdown before, I strongly encourage you to check it out. There are technological solutions. There are also behavioral solutions. There are land management solutions, educating women and girls in low-income countries, allowing Indigenous people to manage their land, clean cook stoves, grassland protection, green roofs. There's over 100 positive, constructive solutions that we can talk about with people. And we can talk about how these solutions can give us cleaner air and water, can protect us from disasters like storms, wildfires, and floods. These solutions can improve our physical and our mental health. They can provide more rather than less affordable energy. Solar plus battery storage is now the cheapest form of electricity in many parts of the world. They can reduce many of our inequalities. They can create healthy ecosystems and foodscapes. And these solutions can give us a more stable world. And when we look for examples of these solutions, they're all around us. We can find examples of countries. We can find examples of companies. We can find examples of cities. We can find examples of churches. We can find examples all around the world, universities, seminaries, young people, mothers, senior citizens. We can find examples of people acting everywhere. The world truly is changing. And when we look for climate action, we realize that that giant boulder of climate action, as we think about it, it is not sitting at the bottom of the hill with only one or two people's hands on it trying to push it up the hill, and it's not moving even a centimeter. No, that giant boulder is already at the top of the hill. It is already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It already has millions of hands on it. And when we add our hands, it will go faster. That is efficacy, and that is the missing piece that people need to act. So when we realize that, that better future is possible, that the action to head there is already underway, that we truly can make a difference by engaging with the place we work, the place we live, the organizations and people that we're part of, we as individuals can affect system change. The only question I think we're left with is this: what are we waiting for? Thank you.
Dr. Hayhoe. Dr. Hayhoe, thank you so much. I'd love to start straight away with a question. I know you're under some time pressure, but one of the groups you belong to is you're an evangelical Christian. You're one of the most prominent American scientists of that group. I'd think of Francis Collins as well. What role do you see with evangelical Christians, many of whom have expressed some doubt about climate science?
So evangelical Christians in the United States are very different than evangelical Christians, or really any type of Christian outside the US. Outside the US, the World Evangelical Alliance, which represents 600 million evangelical Christians around the world, has the former Secretary General, Bishop Ephraim Tendero, was an official representative of his country, the Philippines, to the Paris Agreement. The Archbishop of Canterbury, head of the Anglican Church, the Patriarch Bartholomew, the head of the Orthodox Church, many, many Christian and many faith leaders in general have spoken out urgently about the moral necessity and the need for climate action. And even in the United States, there's organizations like Young Evangelicals for Climate Action and the Catholic Climate Covenant, who speak about the theological basis for action. But in the United States, many people have confused their faith with their politics. 40% of the people in the US who call themselves evangelical Christians don't go to church. So where are they getting their information from? From their political ideology rather than from their theology. In the United States, climate change is today, and has been for the last 10 years, the most politically polarized issue in the whole country. But even there is hope. Because when we begin with something people already care about, and show them that they're the perfect person already, who they are to care, and that there are solutions that are compatible with their values, they can change. So we did an experiment last year with Yale University on social media. We created 4 short videos that talked about climate change from the perspectives that a Republican would share. Free market, personal liberties, national security in the military, and Christian values. Yale University aired these videos on social media, on YouTube and on Facebook for a few weeks, and they tracked public opinion in those areas. And what they found is that being exposed to these short videos, Democrat opinions, that's liberals, they increased maybe 6, 7, 8%. Republican levels of concern over climate change and support for climate action increased twice as much. 15, 16, 17, 18% from watching a 1-minute video that showed why they are the perfect person to care and how there are solutions compatible with their values. So the approach that I talked about today is scalable, and the approach I talked about today can overcome much of our political ideology. And when the Yale University study was published, I said, why aren't we doing this everywhere? And they said, because nobody understands the importance of communication. Nobody wants to support it.
So we've also received a question for you over Twitter, which I wanted to read out to you, and then I'll open to the floor here. But the question is, you're very active on social media. What have you learned from your followers, and how do you engage them in change? So how do you, and I've followed your Twitter account, how important is that to your messaging?
So what I've learned is every social media platform is different. Who I'm engaging with on Instagram is completely different than who I'm engaging with on Facebook or on Twitter. So it's really important to understand your audience and what they want. On Twitter, people want information. They're already concerned, and many of the people I interact with are already activated, but they don't know how to activate other people. And so they're looking for information that they can use to make a difference. On Facebook, people want good solutions. When I share good news solutions of people who are making a difference, ordinary people making a difference through turning their lawn into a pollinator garden or talking to their company about going net zero, that's what people on Facebook are looking for and want to share. On Instagram, people want to know, where do I find hope? Because so often we feel hopeless and despairing confronted with this issue. So understanding who we're speaking to, whether online or offline, is really essential. And often we can understand by asking people questions. And in fact, you even said one of the things that caught your attention was when I asked people on Twitter, where's decarbonization working? And I wanted to know what they had to say and how they shared. And some people shared personal examples, but a lot of other people shared more systematic examples. And it showed me where they were, what they were engaged in, and helped me understand them better.
Yeah, I remember one about people talking about bike lanes going up on Google, so they knew where to bike and how to, I think, navigating Los Angeles. I'd love to open it to the floor. I know you have a little time pressure there, but if we have questions out, please. I see Emilio Mendez has a question for you.
I have a couple of questions. The first one is, you talk about the negative effects of climate change in a very eloquent way. Are there any positive effects of climate change? My second question is there an optimum temperature at which civilization thrives? Or in a different way, suppose we are talking about a decrease, not increase, of 2 degrees with respect to current levels. Should we be equally worried or not?
Mm-hmm. So, as a graduate student, I heard an apocryphal tale, which means I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it answers the first part of your question. There was a Soviet scientist called Mikhail Budiko who did climate modeling back in the 1960s, very early climate modeling. And according to the apocryphal tale that I heard from one of my own professors who collaborated significantly with Soviet scientists back then, he said that according to early climate model results, it looked like every country in the world would be harmed by a warmer planet, except for Canada and the Soviet Union. And so scientists recommended that the Soviet Union burn as much fossil fuels as they could because it would possibly benefit their country. Now, fast forward, and we know that that's not the case. Russia, Canada, Scandinavia, northern countries, they are seeing longer growing seasons, but they're also seeing the expansion of pests, larger wildfires, thawing permafrost, rising sea levels, melting glaciers, changing water supply. The negative impacts, even on countries like Canada, even on Scandinavian countries, the negative impacts already outweigh the positive impacts. And we're seeing this accelerating the more change that we see. In terms of the optimal temperature for human civilization, and that's very important because for the planet, there's no optimal temperature. The planet has been warmer or cooler in the past. The question is us. What is the optimal temperature for humans? And the answer to that is the temperature that we had over the time period which our civilization developed. Every aspect of our civilization, our agriculture, our water systems, our infrastructure, even our geopolitical boundaries, are drawn and determined and designed based on the past, not the future. We don't like it too hot. We don't like it too cold. We like it just right. And today we have already passed that just right zone into a zone that is already too hot. So how much is too much? Is there some magic number? No. It's like there's no magic number of cigarettes that we can smoke before we experience lung damage. But we know that the further we go from the conditions that we experienced in the past, during which we built our infrastructure and allocated our water and our agricultural land and drew our geopolitical boundaries, the farther we go from that stage, the greater and greater the impacts.
So just if you give me a second, the key word is change, not so much warming or cooling within limits, of course. Change is the key factor. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree 100%. If we were cooling just as quickly as we were warming, we would be seeing similar devastation in the opposite direction.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. There's been quite a lot of debate about consumer behavior or individual behavior. And I just wondered from the research you've been doing, whether you had any tips for policymakers or if there are any possibilities of nudging consumer behavior in the right direction towards dealing with climate change.
Well, the idea of nudging is one popularized, I think, by Cass Sunstein, and it was certainly one that was considered and they tried to use very heavily under the Obama administration in the United States. Social nudging has significant evidence behind it, because what we do as human beings is we walk around almost with a pair of antennae up all the time, looking at what people are doing around us to judge what is or is not socially acceptable. So that's where nudging comes in, showing that it's not socially acceptable anymore to drive that giant gas-guzzling SUV. A speedy little electric car is perhaps more socially acceptable already in some circles around the world. Or the idea of plastic bags or plastic bottles compared to reusable ones. So social nudging plays a significant role. But we need change at every level. There's not one single approach that is going to be sufficient. We need change at the level of corporations, at the level of cities, at the level of organizations, and of course at the level of countries as well. But all of those changes are catalyzed when people make a difference. And often in terms of social nudging, when we are able to make the cheapest, most affordable, easiest, and fastest choice, the best choice, that's when rapid social change happens. Because right now, in all too many places around the world, the most affordable, easiest, and fastest choice for transportation, for consumption, for anything that we do is typically not the best choice. And so we're asking people to make a sacrifice of their time. You have to spend more time to figure out how to do it, or making a sacrifice of their money. It actually costs more to do it, or making a sacrifice of having to overcome the knowledge barrier. You have to become more knowledgeable, for example, to install a heat pump these days because the contractor doesn't know how to do it. So you have to educate yourself on how to install the heat pump, even if you'll save money. So we're asking individuals to put significant effort into making the best choice. But if the market shifts, and that's where system-wide change comes in, if the best choice is, again, the easiest default choice, that's where we see widespread consumer adoption of those changes. And that's why we need changes at every level.
That's good. Thank you. Gita, I think you have a question now.
Hi, hi, Katharine. My name is Gita from Indonesia. I just want to tell you that I'm fangirling so hard right now. And also thank you for the TED Talk. Just so you know, because of your TED Talk, there's a movement in Indonesia that our common goal would be to get people to talk about climate, to involve more people. So you started a movement. Thank you. And so I guess, my question would be, because you said it's about knowing your audience, right? And then you also mentioned that the audience are in different layers. And sometimes there's a debate between putting all of the responsibility on the individual, which seemingly trying to avoid the fact that we need systemic change. Now, when you're talking about different audience, what would be your tip in making sure that you can keep track in all of the different messaging that you've been using, and how do you divide and conquer among your own team, for example? Thank you.
That's a great question. I think the most important thing to do with our conversations, and when I say conversations, I don't mean just one-to-one speaking to each other. I mean that the conversations that we might be promoting, or like you said, catalyzing among people who live in the same place or work in the same place or are part of the same organization or the same city. Those conversations should always begin with something we have in common. And if we don't know what we have in common, then let's talk about, what do you care about? Where do you see our organization going? What matters to you personally? Let's find out what matters in terms of that layer, and then use what matters as the foundation for our discussion of where do we go from here? And that's what's so important, because As Bill McKibben says, who's an author who I respect greatly, he says, the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. Another way to put it is, rather than focusing myopically on our climate, our carbon footprint, which is our personal emissions associated with our personal travel, diet, living, what if we focus on our climate shadow? That's the way that we as individuals engage with all of the people who might have children at the same school as our children, or who might attend the same church as us, or who work at the same company as us, or who live in the same neighborhood as us, or who vote for the same province or state or department as us. When we focus on how we together can make a difference, that's when we build that sense of efficacy. And that's when we add more hands to that giant boulder. So if we can do that, focusing on our climate shadow rather than our carbon footprint, we're engaging in what Mother Teresa says. Mother Teresa said, I alone cannot change the world. And you think, well, if Mother Teresa can't change the world, who can? But then she went on, but I can cast a stone into the waters that has many ripples that spread out across the water. And that is what we as individuals can do, beginning with communication.
Again, there's a round of applause going on here, so you're being well received. I wondered, I know you had a hard close, I guess. That was a hard start. No, you are there still. Do you have another couple of minutes, or do you have to rush? Because I know we have more questions around here.
Sure, I could go a few more minutes.
Okay, 2 more minutes. I see Scott Simon has a question for you.
I wonder if I might ask you a question from the base of what you've shared about your religious convictions. Have you tried to advance the argument among people who might have a common vision that we have been given an incredibly precious and irreplaceable gift from God, if I may, and this is our mission. This is the charge we take with us.
Yes, in fact, that concept was first introduced, I believe, by John Calvin back in the 1500s. And it has since been explored significantly by many theologians today, the idea of stewardship or caring for nature or creation. And that idea is not unique to the Christian or the Judeo-Christian faith. You see that concept in most other world religions as well. But for those whose objections are, again, primarily political rather than actually theological, the theology doesn't move them. But for people who are true believers in that sense, who do take the Bible seriously if they're Christians, or they do take whatever else they believe seriously if they're not, for people like that, that argument does work. And then what also works, I find very strongly, is the idea of loving your neighbor. The idea that the poorest and most vulnerable people among us, right here where we live in the city where we are, as well as on the other side of the world, they are the ones who are most affected by the impacts of a changing climate. And so bringing that human face into the impacts and showing the injustice and the inequity of the impacts can also be very powerful for motivating people from a theological or an ethical perspective.
Once again, thank you. Can you take one more? Because they're eager.
Yes, one more, and then I actually have to go off to a TED event after this.
So I thought Daniel, did you have a question, Daniel? I thought earlier on? No, it was wrong.
Last chance.
Oh, but just, you know what, I think we actually, I was wrong on that one, but I wanted to thank you enormously for such a positive start to our afternoon, your morning, because I think we've been sitting here talking. We actually had Bill McKibben here yesterday talking to us, but we've been talking a lot about the challenges we face and trying to come up with technological and innovative solutions. And I think you've set us on a path towards some productive thinking this afternoon. So thank you very much again for joining us, Dr. Hayhoe. It's been wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much.